An airline pilot, puffed up with authority, takes one look at a black man in a hoodie and decides he doesn't belong in first class. He publicly questions and humiliates him, enjoying the quiet support of some passengers. But a slow, steady stream of impeccably dressed professionals begins to fill the cabin, each one greeting the casually dressed man as their boss. The pilot's smug expression is about to be wiped off his face in the most epic and satisfying way imaginable. This isn't just a story of prejudice, it's a tale of glorious, high-flying karma. Stick around. The first-class lounge of Transcontinental Airways at JFK International was an oasis of forced tranquility. Muted taunts music, whispered from hidden speakers, mingling with the gentle clinking of ice in glasses and the low, self-important murmur of business travelers. It was a world designed to insulate its inhabitants from the frantic energy of the main terminal. A holding pen for the privileged before they were loaded into their luxurious, skybound capsules. In a plush leather armchair, tucked away in a quiet corner, sat Marcus Covington. To the casual observer, he was an anomaly in this sea of bespoke suits and designer handbags. He was wearing a simple, dark grey hoodie, the kind made from exceptionally soft, high-quality cotton, but a hoodie nonetheless, a pair of comfortable-looking dark jeans, and pristine white sneakers. On his wrist was a discreet but clearly valuable IWC Portuguesa chronograph, its blue hands a subtle flash of color against the white dial. An open laptop rested on his knees, and his brow was furrowed in concentration as he scrolled through a dense, jargon-laden document. At 45, Marcus Covington was one of the most feared and respected litigators in the country. His firm, Covington & Associates, had made its name taking on an impressive list of corporate giants and winning. They were known for their meticulous preparation, their aggressive courtroom tactics, and their unwavering commitment to their clients. Marcus himself was a force of nature, a man whose calm, unassuming demeanor belied a razor-sharp intellect and a photographic memory. He had argued cases before the Supreme Court, had negotiated multi-billion-dollar settlements, and had a reputation for seeing angles that other lawyers missed. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Queens, the son of a subway conductor and a school teacher. His parents had instilled in him a powerful work ethic and a deep-seated belief in the power of education. He had worked his way through Columbia Law School, often studying on the very subway his father drove, and had graduated at the top of his class. He had started his own firm, with two of his classmates determined to build a practice that was as diverse as it was excellent. Today, he and his team were flying to San Francisco for the start of the biggest trial of their careers. They were representing a small tech startup that had been systematically crushed by a monopolistic software giant, a company called Omnicorp. The case was a legal labyrinth, a David and Goliath battle that had been years in the making. Marcus and his team had spent the last month in a state of near constant work, and this 5-hour flight was a rare opportunity for a final, focused review of their strategy. Marcus preferred to fly in comfort, not for the status, but for the quiet and the space to work. The hoodie and jeans were his battle armor, a way to stay comfortable and focused during long hours of intense mental exertion. He had no interest in impressing his fellow passengers. His only concern was winning his case. A boarding announcement crackled through the lounge, and Marcus drained his glass of water, packed his laptop into a worn leather messenger bag, and headed for the gate. He was one of the first to board, wanting to get settled and back to work before the cabin filled up. As he stepped onto the plane, he was greeted by a flight attendant with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard, sir. May I see your boarding pass?" Marcus showed her the pass on his phone. Her smile didn't falter as she glanced at it. 2A. Right this way, sir. He found his seat, a spacious pod, with a lie-flat bed, a personal minibar, and a large entertainment screen. He stowed his bag, took off his hoodie to reveal a simple black t-shirt, and settled into the seat. He was about to pull out his laptop when a voice dripping with authority cut through the quiet of the cabin. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus looked up. Standing in the aisle was the pilot, a man in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed silver moustache and a chest puffed out with a sense of self-importance. His name tag read Captain Miller. "Can I help you, Captain?" Marcus asked politely. Captain Miller's eyes swept over Marcus, taking in his t-shirt and jeans, his sneakers. There was a flicker of disdain in his eyes, a subtle sneer that twisted the corner of his moustache. "I think there might be a mistake," the pilot said, his voice loud enough for the other boarding passengers to hear. "This is the first-class cabin." Marcus felt a familiar, weary sigh building in his chest. He had played this scene before, in different venues with different actors. "I'm aware of that," he said, his voice even. "My boarding pass says 2A. "I saw your boarding pass," Captain Miller said, his tone implying that the pass itself was somehow fraudulent. "But you look a little too casual for this cabin. Are you sure you're in the right place?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and ugly. A few of the other first-class passengers, men in expensive suits who had just boarded, paused to watch the unfolding drama. Marcus could see the smirks on their faces, the quiet enjoyment of seeing someone they had already mentally dismissed being put in their place. "I'm quite sure," Marcus said, his voice dropping a decibel, taking on a steely edge that he usually reserved for hostile witnesses. "Is there a dress code for first class that I'm unaware of?" The pilot was taken aback by the directness of the question. He had expected Marcus to be intimidated to stammer an apology, to perhaps even offer to move. He had not expected this quiet, unyielding confidence. "There's an expectation of a certain decorum," Captain Miller said, floundering for a justification for his prejudice. "We like to maintain a certain standard in our premium cabins. A standard that's based on the price of a passenger's clothes or the price of their ticket," Marcus asked, his eyes locking onto the pilot's. "Because I can assure you my ticket was paid for in full." The pilot's face reddened. He was losing control of the situation. He had intended to make a quick public example of this out-of-place passenger, to reinforce his own authority. Instead, he was being cross-examined in the aisle of his own plane. "I'm just trying to ensure that all of our first-class passengers feel comfortable," he said, trying to frame his bigotry as a matter of customer service. "And you've decided based on my hoodie that I must be making the other passengers uncomfortable," Marcus said, his voice dangerously soft. He gestured to the two men in suits who were still watching with amusement. "Why don't you ask them?" "Gentlemen, does my presence here diminish your first-class experience?" The two men, suddenly put on the spot, shuffled their feet and looked away, their smirks vanishing. They had been enjoying the show, but they had no desire to be cast as supporting actors in a public display of prejudice. Captain Miller was cornered. He had no legitimate reason to question Marcus's presence in the cabin, and his attempt to rally the other passengers had backfired. He was about to double down to perhaps invent some non-existent regulation when the steady rhythmic click of heels on the jet bridge announced the arrival of more passengers. The first to enter the cabin was a tall, elegant woman with her hair pulled back in a severe but stylish bun. She was wearing a tailored Armani suit that probably cost more than Captain Miller's monthly mortgage payment. She strode into the first-class cabin, her eyes scanning the seats, and then a warm smile broke across her face. "Marcus, she said, her voice a welcome interruption to the tense silence. "I see you've found the good seats." She walked over to seat 2B, right next to Marcus, and placed her briefcase on the seat. Then she turned to the still flustered pilot. "Captain," she said, her smile turning a little cooler, a little more appraising. "Is there a problem here?" Before Captain Miller could answer, another figure appeared. A man in an impeccably cut Tom Ford suit. His shoes so polished they reflected the cabin lights. He was followed by another woman, and then another man, and then another. A slow, steady stream of legal professionals, each one dressed in the expensive, understated armor of corporate law, began to file into the first-class cabin. They were a diverse group, men and women, of different ages and ethnicities, but they all had one thing in common. As they entered the cabin, their eyes found the man in the t-shirt and jeans, and each one of them broke into a smile of genuine warmth and respect. "Morning, Marcus." "Glad we caught you, boss." "Ready for war, Marcus." Each greeting was a fresh blow to Captain Miller's crumbling sense of authority. The man he had tried to humiliate, the man he had dismissed as too casual, was not just a passenger. He was clearly the leader of this high-powered, impeccably dressed army. The final member of the team to board was a young, eager-looking man, his arms full of binders. He hurried over to Marcus's seat. "Mr. Covington," he said, "I have the final Omnicorp depositions you asked for." Marcus Covington. The name finally clicked in Captain Miller's mind. He was a vague follower of business news, and he had seen the name before. Covington and Associates, the giant killers, the firm that was currently taking on Omnicorp, one of Transcontinental Airways' most important corporate clients. The blood drained from the pilot's face. The man he had just tried to eject from first class was not just a lawyer. He was one of the most powerful lawyers in the country, and he was flying to San Francisco to engage in a legal battle that would be front-page news for weeks. The quiet amusement on the faces of the other passengers had been replaced by a look of stunned awe. The flight attendant who had first checked Marcus's boarding pass was standing frozen in the galley, her hand over her mouth. Marcus looked at his team, who were now settling into their seats, filling the entire first-class cabin. Then he turned his gaze back to the pilot, who was now pale and sweating under the cabin lights. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply looked at the man who had judged him so wrongly, and said in a voice that was calm, clear, and absolutely lethal, "Captain Miller, I believe you were about to explain the decorum of this cabin to me and my legal team. Please continue. We're all listening." The storm had not just arrived. It had made landfall, and Captain Miller was standing at ground zero with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The quiet flight to San Francisco was about to become the most turbulent journey of his life. The silence in the first-class cabin was no longer merely tense. It was crystalline, sharp enough to cut. Every passenger, from the two chastened businessmen to the newly arrived legal team, was frozen, their attention focused on the two men at the center of the aisle. Captain Miller stood as if rooted to the floor, his face a ghastly shade of pale, the smug authority having evaporated and been replaced by the dawning horror of a man who has just walked off a cliff and has not yet begun to fall. Marcus Covington remained seated, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, analytical, missing nothing. He had the full, undivided attention of his audience, and he was a man who knew exactly what to do with it. He was no longer just a passenger being harassed. He was a litigator in his natural habitat, and the aisle of the airplane had just become his courtroom. "Captain," Marcus said, again, his voice resonating in the quiet cabin, "you were expressing a concern about standards I'm curious. Could you please articulate for my team and me exactly what those standards are? Is there a memo I missed? A section in the terms and conditions that specifies the required brand of trousers for your premium passengers? One of the younger associates, a sharp-witted woman named Jessica, stifled a laugh with a cough. The lead counsel beside Marcus, the woman in the Armani suit named Sarah, simply raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. She had seen Marcus dismantle arrogant executives on the witness stand with this exact technique, the calm, probing questions that slowly exposed the rot of prejudice beneath a thin veneer of professionalism. Captain Miller opened his mouth, then closed it again. A series of incoherent thoughts scrambled through his mind. He could try to apologize, but it would be a transparently self-serving act. He could try to retreat to the cockpit, but it would be a clear admission of guilt and cowardice. He was trapped by his own arrogance. I apologize if there was a misunderstanding. He finally stammered, his voice a hoarse croak that was a pathetic echo of his earlier authoritative tone. There was no misunderstanding, Captain. Marcus countered, his voice smooth as silk, but with an edge of tempered steel. You saw a black man in a hoodie, and you made an assumption. You assumed I didn't belong. You assumed I was beneath your other passengers, and you chose to voice that assumption publicly in an attempt to humiliate me. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the other passengers relive the ugly moment. My concern, Marcus continued, is not for my own feelings. I've been dealing with men like you my entire life. My concern is for your employer, Transcontinental Airways. They have a brand to protect a duty of care to all their passengers. And you, with your standards, have just become a significant liability. At the word liability, every lawyer in the cabin sat up a little straighter. It was a word they understood intimately. It was a word that meant consequences. It was a word that meant money. Sarah, the lead counsel, now entered the conversation. She didn't stand, but her voice carried an authority that was equal to Marcus's. Captain Miller, she said, her tone cool and professional. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am senior partner at Covington & Associates. I would like your full name, your employee identification number, and the name of the head of flight operations for this airline. We will be in touch. It was no longer a personal dispute. It was now a formal, legal matter. The pilot's face, if possible, grew even paler. He was no longer dealing with an uppity passenger. He was being put on notice by one of the most formidable law firms in the nation. Now that won't be necessary. He sputtered, a sheen of desperate sweat on his forehead. It was a simple mistake. A joke, really. A joke. Marcus's voice was incredulous. You found your own prejudice amusing. Do you think the other passengers found it amusing? Do you think the board of directors of this airline will find it amusing when a video of this joke surfaces online? Marcus gestured subtly to one of his younger associates in the third row, who had been discreetly recording the entire exchange on his phone since the moment the pilot had first raised his voice. The associate gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The pilot's eyes widened in panic. A video. The thought of his face, his words plastered all over the internet, a permanent testament to his bigotry, was a nightmare made real. He was no longer just facing a professional reprimand. He was facing public ruin. The lead flight attendant, who had been hovering nervously in the galley, now rushed forward, her face a mask of frantic damage control. Captain, perhaps you should prepare for takeoff, she said, gently but firmly, trying to pull him by the arm. I'm sure we can sort this all out. Captain Miller allowed himself to be led away, casting one last, terrified look at Marcus. It was the look of a defeated man, a man who had been so thoroughly and publicly dismantled that there was nothing left but a hollow shell of his former self. as the cockpit door clicked shut. A strange sense of catharsis filled the cabin. The two businessmen who had initially smirked at Marcus's predicament were now staring resolutely into their laps, the picture of shame. The other passengers were looking at Marcus and his team with a newfound respect that bordered on awe. Sarah leaned over to Marcus. "Well," she whispered, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. That was an unexpected pre-trial deposition. Marcus allowed himself a small, weary smile. "Just a little warm-up," he said. "Now let's get back to work. We have a real giant to slay." For the next 5 hours, as the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the first-class cabin of Flight 347 to San Francisco was transformed into the most exclusive high-powered law office in the world. Binders were opened, laptops glowed, and quiet, intense conversations took place. The legal team, a well-oiled machine, went about their work with a quiet, focused intensity. But the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The usual stilted politeness of first class had been replaced by a palpable sense of purpose. The flight attendants served the legal team with a deference that was almost reverential. Every request was met with a prompt, "Of course, Mr. Covington," or "Right away, Ms. Jenkins." The incident had served as a powerful, unplanned team-building exercise. It had reminded every member of the Covington & Associates team exactly what they were fighting for. Their case against Omnicorp was not just about intellectual property theft. It was about bullies. It was about arrogant, powerful entities who believed they could crush anyone who didn't fit their mold. Captain Miller, in his own small, pathetic way, was a microcosm of the corporate giant they were about to face in court. His prejudice, his abuse of power, his assumption of superiority. It was the same disease, just on a smaller scale. And they had just watched their leader surgically excise that disease with a calm, unassailable logic that was more devastating than any shouted insult. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, the city lights spread out below them like a carpet of diamonds. Marcus looked out the window, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. The confrontation with the pilot had been an unwelcome distraction, but it had also been a necessary one. It had sharpened his focus, hardened his resolve. He had not sought the fight, but he had not shied away from it either. And as he prepared to disembark, he knew that the consequences for Captain Miller were just beginning. The wheels of justice, both legal and karmic, were now in motion. And for the arrogant pilot who judged a man by his hoodie, the final verdict was going to be severe. The cross-examination was over, but the sentencing was yet to come. The moment Flight 347's wheels touched the tarmac at San Francisco International Airport, the fallout for Captain Miller began to accelerate with the brutal efficiency of a corporate crisis management plan in full swing. Before the seatbelt sign had even been switched off, Marcus's associate had already emailed the video file of the incident to Sarah Jenkins, who had in turn forwarded it to a pre-designated contact in the legal department of Transcontinental Airways, with a simple 3-word message: "Urgent. Call me." As the legal team gathered their belongings, a nervous-looking airline representative was already waiting at the gate. He was a senior manager, pulled from a comfortable desk job to perform a task he clearly dreaded. "Mr. Covington?" he asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. "My name is David Chen. I'm the station manager for Transcontinental here at SFO. On behalf of the airline, I want to offer our most sincere and profound apologies for the incident on your flight today." Marcus simply nodded, his face unreadable. "Your apology is noted, Mr. Chen, but this is no longer a matter for station managers. This is a matter for your corporate counsel. My office will be in touch." The message was clear. This would not be smoothed over with an apology and a voucher for future travel. This was a legal firestorm, and Transcontinental was now in the hot seat. Captain Miller and his co-pilot were instructed to remain in the cockpit until all passengers had deplaned. When Miller finally emerged, his face was ashen. He was met not by the usual ground crew, but by David Chen and two stern-looking security guards. He was not permitted to walk through the terminal. He was escorted down a service stairway and into a waiting unmarked van. His wings, which he had worn with such pride, now felt like a lead weight on his chest. He was no longer a respected captain. He was a liability, being discreetly removed from the scene. The wheels of corporate justice turned with a speed that was breathtaking. The video was undeniable. The presence of Marcus Covington and his entire legal team as witnesses made the situation utterly indefensible. Transcontinental's board of directors was briefed in an emergency conference call that evening. Their primary concern was not the fate of Captain Miller, but the potential damage to their brand and their stock price. They had a multi-million-dollar corporate account with Omnicorp, the very company Covington was about to face in court. The optics were a nightmare. The next morning, as Marcus and his team were delivering their opening statements in a packed San Francisco courtroom, Captain Miller was sitting in a soulless conference room at an airport hotel, facing a panel of executives from the airline. His union representative was beside him, but even he looked grim. The evidence was too overwhelming, the complainant, too powerful. Miller tried to defend himself, to frame his actions as a misunderstanding, a poorly executed attempt at humor. But the video played on the large screen in the room told a different story. It showed a man drunk on his own petty authority, using his position to bully and humiliate a passenger based on nothing more than racial prejudice. The verdict was swift and decisive. By noon, Captain Miller had been fired. His 2-decade career with Transcontinental Airways, his seniority, his pension, all gone. The termination was for gross violation of company policy, discriminatory conduct, and actions detrimental to the safety and comfort of passengers. It was a professional death sentence, but the airline's actions didn't stop there. In an attempt to get ahead of the story and perform a very public act of contrition, they did something unprecedented. The CEO of Transcontinental, a man named Robert Walsh, personally flew to San Francisco that afternoon. He issued a public statement which was immediately picked up by the national news. The actions of the pilot on Flight 347 are inexcusable and represent a betrayal of the values we hold dear at Transcontinental Airways. The statement read, "We have terminated his employment effective immediately. Furthermore, we have issued a formal apology to Mr. Marcus Covington and his team. We are launching a full independent review of our diversity and sensitivity training protocols to ensure that an incident like this never happens again." The story exploded. The video, leaked from an anonymous source within the airline, was everywhere. It was on every news channel, every blog, every social media feed. Captain Miller's face, contorted in a sneer of misplaced superiority, was now infamous. He was the new poster child for casual racism, a cautionary tale for anyone who thought a uniform gave them the right to be a bigot. The immediate aftermath for Miller was a descent into a personal hell. His phone rang incessantly with calls from reporters. His wife, horrified and humiliated, left to stay with her sister. His neighbors, who had once respected him as a distinguished airline captain, now crossed the street to avoid him. The local news had a van parked outside his house. He was a prisoner in his own home, besieged by the consequences of his own actions. For Marcus Covington, the public fallout was an unwelcome distraction, but it had an unintended and not entirely unpleasant side effect. The story of the incident on the plane had cast him as a folk hero, a real-life Atticus Finch who had calmly and brilliantly dismantled a bigot at 30,000 feet. The jury in the Omnicorp case had been instructed to avoid all news coverage of the trial, but it was impossible to completely shield them from the story. They may not have known the details, but they knew that the quiet, dignified lawyer arguing for the plaintiff was a man who did not suffer fools or bullies gladly. The legal team from Omnicorp was furious. The incident had given Marcus an aura of moral authority that was impossible to quantify, but undeniably potent. They had planned to paint him as a ruthless ambulance-chasing lawyer. Now he was seen as a champion of the underdog, a man who fought for justice both in and out of the courtroom. The verdict in the trial, when it came 3 weeks later, was a stunning victory for Covington and Associates. The jury found Omnicorp guilty on all counts and awarded the small startup a record-breaking sum in damages. It was a career-defining win for Marcus, a testament to his team's relentless preparation and his own brilliant legal mind. As he stood on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by his jubilant team, a reporter asked him a question that had nothing to do with the Omnicorp case. "Mr. Covington," she shouted, "do you have any comment on the transcontinental pilot who was fired after your flight to San Francisco?" Marcus paused, the celebratory noise fading into the background. He looked directly into the camera, his expression serious. That pilot's fate was a consequence of his own choices. He said, his voice calm and measured, "My only hope is that his former employer and every other company learns from his mistake. A person's character should be the only thing that's judged. Everything else is just noise." It was a perfect soundbite, a final eloquent closing statement to a drama that had begun with an ugly confrontation in the aisle of a plane. The verdict had been rendered not just in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion. And for Captain Miller, the man who had judged a book by its cover, the story was over. He had been cancelled, deleted, and grounded forever. The public explosion surrounding Flight 347 was a sudden violent event, a shockwave that shattered Frank Miller's life in an instant. But the true nature of his karma was not in that loud initial blast. It was in the long, silent, suffocating fallout that followed a slow-motion collapse of a life built on the fragile bedrock of arrogance. The news cycle eventually moved on. The hashtag plane pilot was replaced by new villains. But for Miller, the consequences were a permanent, grinding reality. In the first few weeks, he operated in a state of indignant denial. He secured a meeting with Tom Henshaw, a notoriously aggressive labor lawyer, convinced he was the wronged party in a clear case of wrongful termination. He sat in Henshaw's plush office, the picture of aggrieved entitlement, and laid out his version of events, a story in which he was a diligent captain, upholding standards, and Marcus Covington was a troublemaker who had used his immense power to orchestrate a witch hunt. Henshaw, a portly man with tired eyes that had seen every form of human folly, listened patiently. When Miller finished his tirade, the lawyer simply swiveled his chair to his computer, clicked a mouse, and played the infamous video on a large monitor. He let it run in its entirety, the audio clear, Miller's sneering condescension echoing in the quiet office. When it was over, Henshaw turned back, his face impassive. "Let me be clear. Frank," the lawyer said, his voice flat and devoid of sympathy. "You don't have a wrongful termination suit. What you have is a highlight reel for your own career suicide. You weren't upholding standards. There is no standard you can point to. You were in the legal sense harassing and discriminating against a fare-paying passenger. The fact that the passenger happened to be a top litigator with his entire firm as witnesses is just the universe having a dark sense of humor. But my record. 20 years of service, Miller protested, his voice rising, means nothing. Henshaw cut in. You work in an at-will employment state. They could fire you for wearing mismatched socks if they wanted to, but they don't need to. They have gross misconduct and actions detrimental to the company. It's an ironclad firing. There isn't a court in this country that would touch this, except to maybe award Mr. Covington damages if he chose to sue you personally, which thank God he hasn't. Henshaw leaned forward, his expression almost pitying. Here's my advice, and it's the only good advice you're going to get. Take their severance offer. Sign the non-disclosure agreement, and pray that people forget who you are. Your career as a commercial pilot is over. Your only goal now should be damage control for your life. The blunt assessment was a physical blow. Miller left the office not with a legal strategy, but with the cold, hard truth of his own indefensibility. That truth became even more visceral when he returned home. His wife Linda was packing a suitcase in their bedroom. Her movements were calm, deliberate, final. "What are you doing?" he asked, the dread in his stomach turning to ice. Linda didn't look at him. She carefully folded a sweater and placed it in the bag. "I'm leaving Frank. I'm going to my sister's." For a few days. To let this blow over, he asked, a pathetic hope in his voice. Finally, she looked at him, and for the first time in years, he saw her not as part of his life's furniture, but as a separate person. Her eyes were not angry. They were exhausted. "There is no blowing over from this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The phone calls the reporters at the door. That's just the noise. The real problem is the shame. My friends, my family. They all saw that video. They saw the man I've been married to for 25 years. That sneer, Frank, the way you looked at that man. I've seen that look before. When you talk to a waiter or a valet or anyone you think is beneath you. I've been making excuses for it for years. I can't anymore. I won't. So that's it. After everything, this isn't about what happened on that plane." "Not really," she said, closing the suitcase with a soft click. "That just showed the world what I've been living with. I'm not going to live with it anymore." A week later, he was served with divorce papers. The professional blacklisting was absolute. He made a humiliating call to an old friend, a VP of operations at a rival airline. "Jim, it's Frank Miller." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "Listen, Jim, I know things look bad, but I'm a damn good pilot. I just need a second chance." The sigh that came back was full of pity. "Frank, I can't. I'm sorry. Even if I put your name forward, it would get flagged by HR, by legal. You're toxic. Nobody will risk the blowback. It's over." His last desperate attempt was an interview with a small, scrappy cargo airline that flew overnight routes to South America. The owner, a grizzled man who looked like he'd wrestled a crocodile, interviewed him in a hangar that smelled of oil and exhaust. Miller realized halfway through that the man had no intention of hiring him. He was just morbidly curious, wanting to hear the story from the horse's mouth. The humiliation was profound. Selling the house was the final surrender. It was the physical manifestation of his life's work, a sprawling suburban home he had lorded over his neighbors. Now he was just another failed homeowner, forced to downsize his life into a series of cardboard boxes. He moved into a dingy two-bedroom apartment in a complex wedged between a freeway and a strip mall. The constant dull roar of traffic was a perpetual mocking echo of the powerful jet engines that had once been his domain. He became a recluse, his days bleeding into one another in a haze of cable news and cheap whiskey. He nurtured his bitterness, replaying the incident in his mind, recasting himself as the martyr. But the outside world would occasionally intrude, reopening the wound. One day, a young man at the pharmacy counter looked at him, then at his phone, then back at him. "Oh my God," the young man said, his voice a little too loud. "You're the pilot. The racist pilot." Frank fled to the store, his heart hammering in his chest, the judgment of a stranger chasing him back to his lonely apartment. Nearly a year after the firing, his mother passed away. He booked a flight to his hometown, and the indignity of the process was a fresh layer of torment. He, Captain Frank Miller, had to navigate the online booking system like a commoner pay extra for a checked bag, and suffer the crowning humiliation of being assigned a middle seat in economy class. The airport was a nightmare. It was his former kingdom, but now he was just one of the herd shuffling along in the security line, his shoes in a plastic bin. As he sat at the gate, waiting for his boarding group to be called, a flight crew walked past. The captain, a woman, was laughing with her young, diverse co-pilots. They moved with an easy confidence, an aura of purpose and belonging. The sight of them so at ease in the world he had lost was like a knife to the gut. On the plane, squeezed between a salesman who was snoring and a college student who was blasting music through her headphones, he tried to distract himself with the in-flight magazine. He flipped through the glossy pages of travel articles and luxury watch ads. And then he saw it, a full-page ad. It was for a law firm. A simple, elegant photograph of a dozen smiling, confident legal professionals. In the center of the group, his gaze calm and direct, was Marcus Covington. The tagline beneath the photo read, "Covington and Associates. Justice for all." Frank stared at the picture, his breath catching in his throat. All the rage, the bitterness, the self-pity he had cultivated for a year suddenly felt flimsy, a pathetic defense against a truth he could no longer escape. He looked at Covington's face, not the face of a villain, but of a man of substance and integrity. He looked at the confident faces of his team, the physical embodiment of the world he had so casually dismissed. And in that cramped, uncomfortable middle seat, 30,000 feet above the country, he no longer soared over the walls of his denial, finally crumbled. It wasn't Covington who had destroyed him. It wasn't the airline, or cancel culture, or a world that had grown too sensitive. It was him, his own ugly sneer, his own puffed-up pride, his own choice to humiliate a man for a moment of fleeting, pathetic power. He had held a winning hand, a great career, a family, a comfortable life, and he had thrown it all away for nothing. The karma wasn't a punishment from an outside force. It was the slow, inevitable harvest of a seed he himself had planted. He crushed the magazine in his fist, the paper wrinkling under the pressure, a perfect metaphor for his own life. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and for the first time, Frank Miller felt truly, utterly grounded, while Frank Miller's world systematically contracted, collapsing into a singularity of bitterness and regret. Marcus Covington's underwent a period of explosive expansion. The stunning victory against Omnicorp, already a landmark legal achievement, became inextricably linked in the public imagination with the drama of Flight 347. The dual narrative, one of a brilliant lawyer dismantling a corporate Goliath, the other of a dignified black man, dismantling an ignorant bully, created a powerful and resonant brand for Covington and Associates. They were no longer just successful, they were significant. The firm's receptionists had to work in shifts to handle the deluge of inquiries. The requests came not just from startups with patent disputes, but from every corner of society, where the powerless felt crushed by the powerful. There was a coalition of farmers from California's Central Valley, whose wells were being contaminated by pesticide runoff from a massive agricultural conglomerate. There was a group of retired factory workers whose pensions had vanished into a labyrinth of corporate restructuring. There was a young software engineer who had been fired for exposing a back door in her company's code that sold user data to third-party brokers. These were the cases that now landed on Marcus's desk, stories of injustice that cried out for a champion. Marcus, in concert with his senior partner Sarah Jenkins and the rest of his team, made a conscious decision to pivot. While they continued to take on high-stakes corporate litigation, they now dedicated a significant portion of the firm's resources to these public interest battles. The Omnicorp settlement had given them a war chest, and Marcus was determined to use it as an arsenal for justice. The firm's atmosphere crackled with a new energy. The younger associates who had once dreamed of making partner and buying a summer house in the Hamptons now spoke excitedly about depositions in small farm towns and the thrill of taking on a chemical industry giant. Marcus had given them a purpose beyond billable hours. This evolution culminated in the formal establishment of a new entity, one that would become Marcus's enduring legacy: the Covington Initiative for Equal Justice. It was a separately funded non-profit arm of the firm, staffed by a dedicated team of lawyers and paralegals. Its mission was ambitious and clear. Its legal aid division would take on individual cases of discrimination pro bono, ensuring that a person's ability to fight for their rights was not determined by the size of their bank account. Their first major victory was for a high school history teacher in Texas who had been fired by a prejudiced school board for teaching the full, unvarnished history of the civil rights movement. The initiative not only won his reinstatement, but also secured a court order mandating comprehensive anti-bias training for the entire school district. The initiative's second division was the corporate transformation practice. This was Marcus's most innovative idea. He believed that while it was crucial to punish bad actors, it was more important to prevent bad actions from happening in the first place. This division would partner with corporations not as an adversary, but as a consultant, helping them diagnose and cure the cultural sicknesses that led to incidents like the one on Flight 347. Their flagship partner in a move that stunned the business world was Transcontinental Airways. CEO Robert Walsh, facing a brand in crisis, had called Marcus personally. The initial conversations were tense. Walsh was a bottom-line executive, wary of what he initially saw as a shakedown. But Marcus didn't demand money or issue threats. He spoke of culture of values, of the long-term liability of a poisoned brand. He laid out a vision for how Transcontinental could become not just a company that had recovered from a scandal, but a global leader in corporate ethics and inclusion. Intrigued, Walsh agreed. The partnership was transformative. The Covington Initiative's team went deep into the airline's operations. They conducted hundreds of anonymous interviews, from the C-suite to the tarmac crews. They rode along on flights, observing interactions. They discovered that Frank Miller's attitude, while extreme, was not an anomaly, but the tip of an iceberg of unconscious bias and an old-guard culture resistant to change. The changes they implemented were seismic. The new training programs were not about political correctness. They were immersive scenario-based workshops that forced employees to confront difficult situations and their own ingrained assumptions. Promotion criteria were rewritten to prioritize emotional intelligence and demonstrated commitment to inclusivity alongside technical skill. The most radical change was the creation of the Independent Civilian Oversight Board, a panel of external ethics experts, community leaders, and legal scholars who were given binding authority to review and rule on all discrimination complaints. It was a bold act of corporate transparency, and it worked. Trust in the airline, both internally and externally, began to rebuild. A year and a half later, Marcus was on a flight to London to deliver the keynote address at an international conference on corporate law and social responsibility. He was flying transcontinental. As he settled into his seat in the redesigned first-class cabin, the decor, now a tasteful blend of modern design and understated comfort, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. A figure appeared by his seat. "Mr. Covington." Marcus looked up. It was the flight's captain. She was a poised, intelligent-looking black woman in her late 30s, her uniform immaculate, her 4 stripes gleaming on her epaulets. "Captain Michelle Harris," she said, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm and confident. "Captain," Marcus replied, smiling warmly. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "I just wanted to welcome you aboard on behalf of the entire crew," she said. Her professional demeanor then softened slightly, and her eyes held a deeper, more personal warmth. "And also, just for me, I wanted to thank you. I was a first officer with another airline when the video of your flight to San Francisco came out. You have no idea what that meant to people like me in this industry. It started a conversation that was long overdue. You made it possible for a lot of us to stand a little taller." Marcus was genuinely moved. "I appreciate you saying that, Captain, but it looks to me like you were born to stand tall. It's an honor to have you at the controls." "The honor is all ours, sir," she said with a final brilliant smile, before turning to address another passenger with the same effortless grace. The exchange, so simple and yet so profound, was the embodiment of the change he had fought for. It wasn't just about a new face in the cockpit. It was about the culture of respect that allowed her to be there, a culture she now commanded. He thought then of Frank Miller. He no longer pictured the sneering, arrogant man in the aisle, but a more pathetic figure, a lonely man in a cheap apartment, trapped in a bitter feedback loop of his own making. Marcus felt a wave of sadness for the sheer waste of it all. Miller had been given every advantage, a respected profession, a comfortable life, and he had poisoned it from the inside out with an ancient, ugly prejudice. His was a self-inflicted wound, and his fate was a necessary, if tragic, consequence. Justice had been served, but Marcus found no joy in the man's ruin, only a renewed conviction that his own work was far from over. He opened his laptop. The screen illuminated his face with its soft glow. The first document on the screen was the preliminary injunction brief for the Central Valley Farmers case. There were expert testimonies on water toxicity levels to review legal precedents on corporate negligence to reread. There was another Goliath to slay. As the powerful engines of the Airbus A350 spooled up, pressing him gently back into his seat, he looked out of the window. The plane taxied onto the runway, its powerful lights cutting through the darkness. He thought of the two divergent paths that had been irrevocably set that day on Flight 3427. One path had led to this, to a cramped middle seat on a flight to a funeral, a journey into a past with no future. The other path led here to a lie-flat bed in a cabin filled with respect, a journey towards a new horizon, a sky of limitless possibility, with work still to be done. The plane accelerated a roar of controlled power and lifted gracefully into the night. Marcus Covington was flying. The story of Marcus Covington and Captain Miller is a stark reminder that in the modern world, there are no small acts of prejudice. In an age of smartphones and social media, every action can have a massive and often permanent consequence. Captain Miller didn't just lose his job. He lost his reputation, his future, and his identity, all because he chose to judge a man by his clothes instead of his character. On the other hand, Marcus Covington's calm and powerful response reminds us that the best way to fight ignorance is with intelligence and integrity. If this story of high-flying karma and ultimate justice resonated with you, and if you believe that character, not appearance, is what truly matters, then please help us spread this message. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the next story of satisfying karma and real-life justice. Thanks for watching.